This video is going to demonstrate how to balance chemical equations using a quick and easy method that will work for any chemical equation. Here are the detailed steps so that you have them, but we're actually just going to put them to practice. A couple of things to note is we want to make sure we take one element at a time and tackle those complex compounds first, and then make sure we reduce if needed so that the smallest possible whole numbers are being used in our equations. So our first equation is dihydrogen plus dichlorine gives us or yields hydrogen monochloride. So we have to check to see if it's balanced. In order to do that, we're going to list out the number of atoms for each element involved on the reactant side and on the product side. So we have 2 hydrogens, and we're going to represent those by 2 green circles. We also have 2 chlorines, so we'll represent that with 2 red circles. This is for the reactant side. Then we look at the product side. We have 1 hydrogen and 1 chlorine, and again we'll use a green and a red circle to show those. So checking to see if they're balanced, we want to make sure that since we have 2 greens on the left, we want 2 greens on the right, and we don't have that, so it is not balanced. So then we have to ask ourselves what we can do in order to balance it. And we can add a coefficient to that and get a second molecule or a second compound of hydrogen monochloride, and then it's balanced. So that's just real quick. I'm going to move on to the actual work. The first thing I'm going to do is draw a line that divides the reactant side of the equation from the product side of the equation. And I'm going to list all of the different elements that are on each side of the equation. They will be the same elements on both sides, but I'm just going to list them. We have nitrogen and hydrogen, and we're going to list them in the same order on both sides of the equation. Now we're going to count the number of atoms for each element present. So looking at the left side, the reactant side, the subscript next to the N tells me that there are 2 N's, and therefore there are also 2 hydrogens. And then looking at the product side, when there is no subscript, that means there's a 1, so there's 1 nitrogen, and we have 3 hydrogens. Now the goal of balancing is that we get these numbers to be equal on both sides of the equation. How am I going to set these numbers to equal each other? I can't change the subscripts of the compounds because that changes the compound. Those are set in stone. What I can do is change the coefficient, the number in front of the chemical compound. So looking at N, remember we want to start with the most complex. So we look at NH3 and the N involved in that, and there's only 1 on the right, 2 on the left. One thing I cannot do is decrease those numbers. I always have to build up. So I need to make the N on the right a 2. In order to do that, I have to place a coefficient in front of that compound. When I do that, I get 2 N's. But notice that also changes my H's. I now have 6 H's. So my N's are the same, but my H's are not. And I see that I have 6 on the right hand side and only 2 on the left hand side. So I find the H's, and I have to ask myself what number can I place in front of that will yield 6 atoms of hydrogen. And I can place a 3, which will give me 6. And now my equation is balanced. Now that it's balanced, I will finish it up by placing 1s in front of any compound that does not have a coefficient written yet. So we draw a line separating the sides of the equation. We list out the elements in the same order on both sides of the equation. We count how many atoms of each element are present, and then we check to see if it's balanced. I have 1 and 1, 2 and 2, so this one is already done. What we would do is write ones. That is our last example, but keep in mind these can be more complicated. You're just going to do the same thing. Draw a dividing line, identify the elements involved on both sides, list them out in the same order, count the number of atoms of each element present, and then balance. Use lowest common denominators when necessary, and just keep going back and forth, checking each time until all of them is balanced. Then make sure you're writing it in the lowest form possible.